Hi, this is Esteban Sanchez from Gallerad. When counting function points, we apply a technique called functional decomposition. We basically take an application and we decompose it into smaller pieces. Each of these pieces is called an elementary process. In this video, I'm going to provide a deep dive on those elementary processes. I hope you enjoy the video. In function points, we look at 5 different subcomponents or elementary processes. External inputs bring data into the application. External outputs present information to the users or external systems and include calculations. External queries present information to the users or external systems, but these do not include any calculations. Internal logical files are the data owned and maintained by the application, while external interface files are data that the application uses as reference only. Now, let's take a look at some rules that should be applied when identifying all of these subcomponents. In function points, all of these components are actually called elementary processes. An elementary process is the smallest unit of activity that is meaningful to the user. This means that an elementary process is recognizable by the user and satisfies a user requirement. In addition, an elementary process constitutes a complete transaction, meaning that no more processing is required before or after the elementary process has been completed. An elementary process is also self-contained. This means that all necessary steps, such as validations, calculations, and modifications, are included within the elementary process. Finally, an elementary process leaves the application in a consistent state. This means that once the elementary process has been completed, the application is ready to perform the next action. In other words, the application is not hanging or stopped waiting for something else to happen. A good example of an elementary process is the registration of a customer into the CRM system. This process is meaningful to the user and satisfies a user requirement. It constitutes a complete transaction because all the information about the customer is entered into the system. It is self-contained because no additional steps are required to satisfy the requirement, neither before nor after the completion of the elementary process. And finally, it leaves the application in a consistent state as once the elementary process has been completed, the application stores the data and returns to the consistent state, waiting for the next action from the user. So, in essence, an application can be seen as a collection of elementary processes. These elementary processes are integrated together, forming what is called a software application. The application itself works like an engine to satisfy the business requirements. So in summary, there are 2 major categories of elementary processes. We have data files, which are essentially the data at rest. And then we have transactions, or data in motion. Underneath data files, we can have internal logical files, or ILFs, and external interface files, or EIFs. Underneath transactions, we have external inputs, or EIs, external outputs, or EOs, and external queries, or EQs. Let's start with internal logical files, or ILFs. An internal logical file is basically a group of data that is maintained by the application. The data is user recognizable, which means that the user knows and understands that this data exists. The data is also logically related, which means that it includes information about a single data entity. For example, if you have a database of customers, you don't mix that information with your purchases or orders. Those could be different data entities. Customers and purchases are separate data entities, and therefore they are separate logical files. A good example of an ILF is the contact information inside your phone. This group of data is maintained by the application, is recognizable by the user, and is also logically related. So this is a good example of an internal logical file. The next type of data files are external interface files, or EIFs. An external interface file is basically a group of data that is referenced by the application, basically a read-only file. An external interface file is also user-recognizable and logically related. And finally, an external interface file is data that belongs to another application. So this data is maintained by an external application, which is not the application that we are counting. In this example, we have two applications. We have My Bank, which is the application being counted, and we have an exchange rates application, which maintains a database of exchange rates. So for My Bank, which is the application being counted, the exchange rates database is an example of an external interface file. Let's start with transactions now. The first type of transaction is an external input or EI. An EI is basically a transaction that brings data into the application. The data is stored within an ILF, or the data can also be control information. Control information is data that alters the behavior of the system or tells the system what to do under specific conditions. A good example of an EI is adding a contact in your smartphone. As you can see, this information is coming into the application. After you fill the form, the information crosses the boundary of the application and it is stored within the contacts ILF. So this is a good example of an external input or EI. An external output or EO is a transaction that presents data to the user. This implies that the data leaves the application being counted and is presented to the user. An external output includes calculations. This could be any type of mathematical or logical operations performed on the data. Finally, an external output can also create derived data. This is additional data that gets created as part of the transaction and is also presented to the user. An example of an EO is a report from your heart rate monitor. As you can see, the information in this report is leaving the application and it also includes calculations. Therefore, this is classified as an external output or EO. And last but not least, we have external queries. An external query is similar to an EO in the fact that they both present information to the user. However, the external query cannot perform any calculations nor create any derived data. An external query is basically pure retrieval of data for presentation. A good example of an EQ is a list of email contacts from your email application. As you can see, the information is leaving the application and it is being presented to the user. However, no calculations or derived data are involved. This is purely a retrieval and presentation of data to the user. So this classifies as an external query or EQ. And there you go. Those are the 5 different elementary processes that you can have in function points: external inputs, external outputs, external queries, internal logical files, and external interface files. We also went through the identification rules for each elementary process. Please follow us on YouTube for more informative videos like this one. This was Esteban Sanchez from Galorad. Thank you very much.